We've noticed a real thread of curiosity in the questions you've been sending our way lately, all really centered around HIV and AIDS.
Yeah,
It's a topic with, well, a lot of layers where the established science kind of bumps up against some really different perspectives.
it really does.
So for this deep dive, we thought we'd go straight to the heart of what you seem to want to know.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So our mission here is to explore the sources we've gathered and try to clarify some of those key questions you've raised. We're focusing on the fundamentals, really. Like,
Ah.
does HIV actually cause AIDS? Are they contagious infections? What about the testing? Is it reliable blood work? Or maybe something else entirely?
Okay.
And, ultimately, what does our collected information tell us about the reality of AIDS itself?
Hmm.
We look at scientific articles, news reports, and, yeah, some quite alternative viewpoints to try and unpack these crucial questions.
Okay, so let's start with the cornerstone, maybe, the mainstream understanding. Our sources definitely emphasize the widely accepted scientific view that HIV, human immunodeficiency virus,
Right.
is the cause of AIDS, acquired immunodeficiency syndrome.
That's right. And a pivotal moment, which our sources highlight, was the discovery of HIV itself.
Hmm.
The Nobel Prize awarded to Luc Montagnier and Françoise Barsanussi back in 2008 for that work.
Yeah, I remember that.
But it's also important to remember the concurrent research by Robert Gallo
Hmm.
and all the subsequent discussions around where the initial virus samples even came from. Bit of a backstory there.
Right, and the narrative often credits Robert Gallo with actually providing the proof that HIV is the cause of AIDS, even if the, let's say, initial discovery is attributed to the French scientists.
Hmm.
There was even some controversy around patents back then, wasn't there?
There was. But here's where the picture gets, well, a lot more complex. Our sources also lay out a significantly different interpretation. Indeed. We have sources that argue quite strongly, actually, that HIV does not cause AIDS.
Really? Who's making that argument?
Well, figures like Peter Duesberg, he's a biochemistry professor, and even Nobel laureate Walter Gilbert are mentioned as having questioned this link.
A Nobel laureate. Wow.
Yeah. And it's noted they faced, considerable opposition for these views. Professional setbacks, funding cuts, even ridicule, according to these sources.
And what's the core of their argument? Why do they doubt the link?
Well, the central point seems to be that AIDS isn't like a single disease entity caused by just one virus.
Okay.
Instead, they propose it's more like a collection, a syndrome, right,
Yeah.
of more than 25 different diseases and conditions.
25. Like what?
The sources give examples ranging from pneumonia and herpes to things like candidiasis, various cancers, other infections,
Hmm.
even potential damage from, say, vaccines and antibiotic or malnutrition.
Hmm.
And specifically in Africa, they point to conditions that were already known, like TB, malaria, dysentery, leprosy, and something referred to as slim disease.
So the idea is these things already existed.
Exactly. The perspective presented here is that the AIDS epidemic, as we generally understand it, was essentially constructed by grouping these pre-existing conditions together.
And then linking them to having HIV.
Precisely. Linking them to the presence of HIV. So this directly challenges that fundamental causal relationship most people accept. It raises a key question from these sources. Is AIDS one single disease caused by HIV, or is it a syndrome covering many different illnesses?
That's a really fundamental difference in how you'd understand this whole issue. Wow. Okay, shifting gears slightly then. One of our sources brings up some interesting research, I thought, from the Gladstone Institute of Virology and Immunology. It looked at how HIV might actually impact the body, like at a cellular level.
Ah, yes.
And it suggests that the death of CD4 T cells, which is, a key characteristic of AIDS, might not primarily be caused by the free-floating HIV virus itself.
Right, that's the fascinating part of this research. The finding that CD4 T cell death seems to be driven mainly by direct cell-to-cell transmission of HIV.
So not the virus floating around, but cells touching.
Exactly. From infected cells to uninfected cells. They observed that when HIV tries to infect a resting cell, just on its own, the infection often doesn't really take hold. It's unsuccessful. But fragments of the virus's genetic material, its DNA, can remain behind in that cell.
Okay.
Then later, during cell-to-cell contact, these fragments can trigger a kind of self-destruct mechanism within the cell that wasn't even properly infected initially.
So it's the direct contact, the touching between infected and maybe these resting T cells, and the transfer of these viral bits that sets off this lethal chain reaction.
Pretty much, it involves activating an enzyme called caspase-1.
Caspase-1, okay.
And that basically initiates the cell's self-destruction, a process called pyroptosis.
Huh. And what are the implications of that?
Well, they're quite interesting. The study's senior author suggests that we could figure out ways to block this cell-to-cell transmission.
Stop the touching.
Yeah, stop the direct transfer, basically. We might be able to halt or at least slow down the progression from just being HIV positive to developing full-blown AIDS.
So it shifts the focus a bit, doesn't it? Away from just the virus particles in the blood.
Exactly. Towards understanding and maybe disrupting this direct cellular interaction. It's a different angle.
Okay, so we've looked at ideas about what might cause AIDS or the conditions called AIDS. Let's tackle another core question you mentioned. Are HIV and AIDS contagious?
Right.
The prevailing scientific view, of course, is yes, HIV is a contagious virus. It spreads through specific bodily fluids. We all know that narrative. But, as we've seen, our sources also offer a different perspective here, too.
Yes, they do. A key argument presented in some sources is that the patterns observed in the quote-unquote AIDS epidemic don't neatly align with typical contagious viral outbreaks.
How so?
Well, for example, in the US and Europe, the increase in cases wasn't really the rapid exponential growth you often see with a new, highly contagious virus spreading through a population.
Okay, what else?
Plus, there was that significant prevalence among men, particularly men who used intravenous drugs or identified as homosexual.
Mm.
The argument is that this doesn't necessarily fit a randomly spreading contagion model.
Mm. And what about in Africa? The argument continues that if you look there, the situation is different again, right?
Right. The rate of what's classified as AIDS has been, according to these sources, more consistent over time. Less of a dramatic impact on overall population growth than you might expect from a devastating epidemic. And, crucially, a significant overlap with those pre-existing diseases we mentioned earlier.
Like TB and malaria.
Exactly. So this raises the question, is a single contagious virus really the primary driver in both contexts? Or are different factors at play?
So what's the alternative explanation, particularly for Africa?
Well, the contrasting view suggests that maybe non-contagious factors are playing a bigger role there. Things like widespread malnutrition, parasitic infections, poor sanitation, things that were already weakening immune systems long before HIV was identified.
Leading to conditions that then get classified as AIDS.
That's the argument presented. So the whole idea of AIDS as a purely contagious disease is definitely challenged by these observations in our sources.
Okay, this naturally leads us to, well, the really important question of testing. How do we know who has HIV or AIDS? Is there a reliable blood test? Or are questionnaires involved? And do those vary? Lots of questions there.
Yeah, it's a critical area. Our sources do confirm, yes, the existence of blood tests designed to detect antibodies to HIV. These are the standard tests used globally.
Right.
However, one of our sources makes a very direct, very strong claim. It states flat out that there isn't even a reliable test for AIDS itself available anywhere in the world.
Wow. Not for AIDS, specifically. That's a strong statement that really makes you pause.
It does. And the skepticism around the HIV testing doesn't stop there.
Okay.
There's an argument presented that a positive result on an HIV test, the antibody test, can potentially be triggered by a surprisingly long list of other things, over 60 different conditions reportedly.
60, like what kind of thing? Oh,
The list mentioned includes things like recent vaccinations, malnutrition, multiple sclerosis, measles, influenza, even leprosy is mentioned.
so that raises serious questions about how specific these tests actually are for HIV, right? If other things can cause a positive.
That's exactly the point being made. It questions the specificity. And adding another layer here, our sources reference statements apparently from the manufacturers of ELISA tests. That's a common type of HIV antibody test.
What do the manufacturers say?
They reportedly state that their tests, by themselves, are not intended to actually diagnose AIDS.
Not for diagnosis. Okay.
And similarly, the manufacturers of the genetic HIV testing kits, the PCR tests, apparently indicate their kits are not meant for screening or definitively confirming HIV infection in a diagnostic sense.
So wait, the tests detect antibodies or genetic material maybe, but they aren't necessarily a straightforward confirmation of an active HIV infection that will lead to AIDS. Is that the idea?
That seems to be the concern raised in these sources, yes. And one source also points to worries about a lack of consistent standards, like how different labs actually conduct the HIV testing.
Standardization issues.
Exactly. And variations in how the results are interpreted. So, this lack of uniformity could definitely lead to different outcomes for the same person, depending on maybe where or when they're tested.
That's concerning. Now, you mentioned questionnaires earlier. Did the sources say anything about whether AIDS questionnaires are used or if they differ by country?
It's important to note here, the sources we examined for this deep dive, They actually didn't provide any information on that specific point. Nothing about AIDS questionnaires or variations between regions.
Okay, so we can't speak to that based on this material.
Correct. But the reliability and the specificity of the blood tests themselves clearly points of really significant debate within our sources.
Which brings us, I suppose, to a really huge and potentially controversial question that came up in the materials. Is AIDS real? Or could it be some kind of construct, maybe even a fraud, possibly linked to, financial interests, particularly the pharmaceutical industry?
Yeah, this is a very serious allegation that is indeed raised quite directly in some of our sources.
What's the argument?
The argument presented is that the whole AIDS fraud, as they term it, is a massive financial undertaking. We're talking potentially billions of dollars.
Billions. Benefiting who?
These sources suggest beneficiaries could include the American government, particularly through programs like PEPFAR, operating internationally.
Right.
Exploiting unsuspecting countries is a phrase used.
Wow.
There's even a very specific and frankly quite serious claim in one source alleging that in Nigeria, the American government provided AIDS drugs specifically in exchange for unrefined crude oil.
Crude oil for drugs. That's an extraordinary claim. That would certainly suggest motives beyond just humanitarian aid, wouldn't it?
It absolutely would. And the pharmaceutical industry is also highlighted, of course, as a major beneficiary, profiting hugely from the sale of antiviral drugs, like AZT is mentioned frequently.
AZT, right.
And there's a critical perspective presented on, say, celebrities who publicly support the mainstream AIDS narrative. The implication seems to be they might be unwittingly, or maybe wittingly in some views, contributing to this alleged fraud.
And does this argument connect to funding as well?
Yes. The argument extends to the idea that the kind of widespread fear generated around AIDS has channeled enormous amounts of research funding into this one area.
Potentially overshadowing research into other major health conditions.
Exactly. One source even suggests a big disparity in funding compared to diseases like diabetes, for instance.
And what about the definition of AIDS itself? Does that come into the fraud argument?
It does. Some sources propose that the very definition of AIDS might be flawed because it could be ignoring or downplaying other, maybe man-made environmental factors that can suppress the immune system.
Like what kind of factors?
Things like exposure to toxins, recreational drug use, heavy use of antibiotics over long periods. The idea here is that these non-viral factors might be contributing significantly to the immune deficiencies that are then being labeled as AIDS.
Okay, so it's a really complex and challenging set of arguments to even consider, isn't it? On one side, you have these claims of a potential massive fraud driven by financial and political interests.
Right.
And on the other, you have the widely accepted scientific understanding of HIV causing AIDS. It's clear our sources present very, very different interpretations of the same health challenges.
Starkly different, yeah. And it's worth noting just briefly that some public health bodies like the Southern Nevada Health District mentioned in one source explicitly warn against fraudulent AIDS cures and treatments, which often play on conspiracy theories and dangerously urge people to stop their prescribed medications. So that's another side to this complex issue.
Right, important context.
Indeed. And as we sort of bring this deep dive towards a close, it's just really evident that the sources we've explored offer profoundly contrasting perspectives on some very fundamental questions about HIV and AIDS.
Yeah.
We've looked at the established scientific view, HIV as the cause, alongside arguments directly questioning that link. We've touched on the nature of transmission. Is it purely contagious? The controversies and questions surrounding the testing methods.
The reliability, the specificity.
Exactly. And these very serious claims of potential financial motivations and even outright fraud.
This exploration really leaves us, and hopefully you listening, with a truly intricate picture. It highlights the ongoing debates and just the multiple ways the available information can be and is being interpreted.
Definitely. And so maybe for our final thought for you to ponder, consider this. Given these conflicting perspectives, these starkly different viewpoints, and the sheer complexity surrounding HIV and AIDS, how should you navigate information about significant health issues like this?
That's a tough one.
It is. And maybe what responsibility do researchers, public health organizations, even the media have in fostering transparency and facilitating open critical dialogue, even when the topics are uncomfortable or challenge established views?
Yeah, it's certainly a lot to consider. And we hope this deep dive has offered you a valuable, if complex, look at the different viewpoints that exist out there.